different parts of the world. Just by way of introduction, as Tony has said, just to give some praise and recognition for Tony Ward's amazing Black History walks that he does throughout the year and for many years, basically telling our story, whether it be in Africa, the Caribbean, or Asia, North America, and basically shedding some light on those places where our stories generally go untold, unsung. And I first came across Tony in the British Museum, giving a marvelous talk on the African, Caribbean, and Asian contribution to the First and Second World War. So I think I thank him for his indulgence and giving the opportunity to tell part of my story to everybody. There'll be time at the end for questions. I have a problem, like most lawyers, particularly badly, of talking far too much. So I'm timing myself. I'll try and keep an eye on questions as they arise, and try and break up my discussion as much as I can. So, who am I? Well, I'm sitting in Nairobi, Kenya, and I say welcome to any Kenyans who are listening, and other East Africans particularly, because they've given me a marvelous reception. My story, in a sense, it does not just begin in 2015 when I confronted the judiciary with what I felt was their racism. And the story, in a sense, begins, and I have to tell a bit of my personal history, about a young boy growing up in the Northeast as a medical practitioner. My mum was a housewife. My parents didn't grow up together, and I lived with my mum. And you know, at those times, those of you who grew up in the 60s in the Northeast will know that is a very lonely place for a Black kid to grow up. But actually, my mum was one of those people who had a keen sense of the necessity of awareness about culture and custom. My dad, despite being a very strong West African man, was rather anglicized, unfortunately. But I think got there later on in life. And as I told him when he said he voted for Margaret Thatcher, you know, there's a limited amount of patience you need to have with your parents. But I had on the whole, very happy childhood. I went to boarding school in Bow School in Durham. The same Durham school is actually now in Nairobi, Kenya. Secondary modern school in Ashington, where the Charlton brothers played football, and received, as you might have, a lot of racial abuse in the few years there, and at some, Bow School, but survived. And I think what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But it certainly, as many people listening to this will be aware, it gives you a very strong sense of your own racial identity. And so my early memories are of the apartheid struggle, of seeing pictures of Hector Peterson and others killed in Sharpeville, in the Sharpeville massacre, and Soweto massacres that followed later. Early influences were seen on TV, Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and my one and only hero, Muhammad Ali. And, you know, anybody who was around at that time, I watched with glee when he beat Henry Cooper. And I can assure you that I went in, and I didn't need to punch the first white boy that abused me, but it certainly gave me an enormous amount of confidence. And over the next many, many years, that sort of joy was brought home, as even being alone in the Northeast, more or less, by that time in a grammar school, Morpeth Grammar School, you get to see that you're not alone, and that you're part of a far greater struggle. And that, as opposed to being the person on Hadrian's Wall, which the Romans built to separate themselves from those barbaric Scots, you're not on the games of cowboys and Indians. You begin to wonder why. You're always the Indian, and the Indians always lose. But in actual fact, it's part of your story, and you assert yourself and your conscious and your strength. So I give thanks to all those people in my childhood, African, Caribbean, and white at the time, who fought on my side. And just an early vignette about where you get your help from the most unexpected quarter is in a mining village, defending myself from attack with coke and coal, which is particularly vicious. And about, I think, 6 years old, I was quite good and threw quite a few well-blowed aims at my attackers. And there was a young kid, who must have been about 10 or 11 on my right-hand side, who said, I think you need some help. And I turned around, and of course, all the kids were white. And he said, I think you need some help. And together we managed to sling some real rocks at the heads of our attackers, or my attackers, until the teachers came and eventually stopped it. But it was a lesson, in a sense, that help get in fighting racism or oppression of any sort sometimes comes to the most unexpected quarters. And if I knew who that boy was, I would still thank him, because obviously that sense of justice or injustice was what hopefully motivated him that day. So, fast forwarding, there are many instances I could recall, but particularly those early influences of Muhammad Ali, Dr. Martin Luther King, the civil rights struggle in America, you equate with your own. And so whether it's at boarding school in Durham, or it's at a secondary modern school or at a grammar school, you actually understand what it is to be of African descent. And you know that in later years, there's a marvelous book called Staying Power. It was the history of Black people in Britain, which I read when I was in my mid-20s, originally by a Jamaican called Scobie, and eventually written by a white man called Peter Fryer. And it chronicles a history of African, Caribbean, and Asian people in Britain. And I thought I was the first person in Northumberland. I was not. I thought I was the first person in Scotland who was born in Edinburgh. I was not. And it gave me tremendous strength to know that, in actual fact, my story was a story of many hundreds of thousands of my forefathers and foremothers, in a sense, who had come to the United Kingdom, either in chains or liberated themselves, and had achieved great prominence. Oladayo Equiano, Felix Hercules in the struggle for equality in Cardiff, and many, many others whose names are lost in the mists of time, were there before I was. So this, if anything, and I want to try and convey it to all that I'm listening to today, is a testament to our strength. And in a sense, the last few years, that is, of my struggle, are as nothing to what my ancestors faced in the transatlantic crossing, surviving slavery. My family originally, we don't know where in probably West Africa we originated from, but my father's family settled in Freetown eventually after leaving Georgia during the American Civil War, striving to flee to Canada and Nova Scotia, staying there for around about 10 years is the oral tradition, and then fleeing from, in a sense, the hardship and deprivation in Nova Scotia and Canada, coming to London in 1873, where my forefathers he married a white English woman. He dropped his slave name and the name Herbert. And in the 1870s, the habitable, and they shortened the name to Herbert and went to settle in Freetown, as the name implies, for free slaves. And they became part of the Creole community. My sister, who's probably listening, Dr. Herbert, sadly discovered that maybe we have no trace of Sierra Leonean ancestry as such, but we have 3% Kenyan. The story is one of what slavery did and still does to our lineage and our ancestry. But in a funny sort of way, it's good to say I am from everywhere on the continent, and a mix of much. So, coming, I suppose, to the other influences, my white grandmother was a jet. She fought during the miners' strike. She was disabled. She had a club foot, and was very proud, hardened socialist, and helped to set up the Independent Labour Party. And if anything, she demonstrated that there is an issue of race and class which can transcend the struggle, and therefore it's one in which many of us continually have difficulty with. Is it possible to unite with people of other classes, religion, culture, and fight racism. And yes, it is. Not always easy, but it is possible. So I came to the bar, not because I had a vacation to be a human rights barrister, I hate to admit, but because I wanted to be in some sort of profession which paid well. I failed the solicitor's exams, I have to say, at Guildford. I was too busy doing everything I shouldn't and playing. And I took a big knock to my confidence. So I went to France for a year. I worked in Paris in a sweet factory, worked in Aix-les-Bains and Val d'Isère, and I suppose had a glorious year skiing and learning to speak French. Came back and did the bar exams, learnt my lesson, and passed the bar exams and met some marvelous people and came to know people such as Ernest Weeks QE, Courtney Griffiths QC, many, many others who, as well as my very good friend, Tanu Mvagan, inspired me. And through her and the late Joy Okoye, I joined the Society of Black Lawyers. People such as Kwabena Owusu and many, many others who you may have heard of in London were inspired to join the SBL. And if it hadn't been for the Society of Black Lawyers, I would not have been radicalized. I would not have necessarily visited the Africa Center in Covent Garden or got in touch with my history, legal history. John Thorpe qualified, I think, in 1853, the first barrister of A descent, Mon Mahon Gos, qualified in 1864, and therefore they were the pioneers. And so when I arrived, I was person you should be like is Sigbert Kadri QC, Narayan, the marvelous Guyanese orator who founded the Society of Black Lawyers along with Sigbert. And they inspired me, and we went to meetings at the former Greater London Council building, the old GLC. And one of the first people I met, only briefly, was Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael. I remember standing next to this very elegant guy, trench leather coat, who and sound every sort of person that I wanted to become, and didn't quite have the courage at that time. But he, as you know, was the leader of the civil rights struggle, one of the icons, giving speeches at the Oxford Union when he was 21 years old, and lighting the fire with his writings and speeches before he left the United States to go to Guinea and continue the Pan-African movement with Miriam McCabe and many, many others. So I owe him a debt of gratitude for that inspiration, and many others too numerous to elucidate. And so the struggle has been a marvelous journey. I've met some amazing people. You're listening now, and others I can only pay tribute to in passing in this all too brief resume. But it was along the way a struggle which took me into family law. It took me into Liverpool Law Centre and fighting injustice in the low-level war that was going on between the black community, the police in Liverpool, in Bristol, in Cardiff. And again, many other lawyers had been there before me, been deported from Cardiff in 1919, defended the community in South Shields, where some of my ancestors on my English side came from, and in Newport and in Docks. So this was a unique struggle, which was only part of an ongoing process. And therefore I came to know of the Pan-African Congress in 1900, the Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, and all those iconic people who in a sense have laid foundations for the learning of I have over recent years. So at the bar, it was very much a defined struggled. I was an Italian working class barrister called Gino Connor, who gave me a break. I went for a pupillage interview Bristol and Nottingham. In a few minutes, it was quite clear that Peter Herbert that walked through the door was not the Peter Herbert they were expecting. And I was, I suppose, vacated on the train pretty quickly back to London, being asked, well, why don't you go back to, and I had to fill in and say, actually, Newcastle, in my little Geordie accent that I had at the time, like, you know. And so it was clear that myself and my other colleagues who arrived at the bar were facing a real hurdle. And so people such as employment judge Christiana Hyde, many others who fought at that time for equal rights, Chris Boothman, Michael Reed, Michael Hall, Salish Mehta, and the Society of Asian Lawyers. It was set up later. We actually had our work cut out, not only to represent our people in court, but also to make sure that Black people entered the legal profession. And we faced enormous hurdles. And so you will know that in the history of the bar, certainly, it was 1992 before Lord Scrivener, the chairman of the bar, introduced an equality code. And that was done on the threat of resignation, with a room full in the upper balcony of the Bar Council CLE building, which resembled a bit of something out of Gone with the Wind, actually, with the white folks all down below and the black folks, apart from one or two, down upstairs in the balcony. And equality codes had to be fought for. It was not, justice did not wing in on the plane of inevitability, but actually had to be fought for at every stage. And so myself and many other members of the bar took part in the Handsworth defense campaign led by Rudy Narayan in 1995. We went to Liverpool in 1988 for my first time in Toxteth, and we were given an enormous welcome by the late Solly Bassi, Peter Bassi, and many others in the community in Liverpool 8, to whom I owe a huge debt of gratitude. And we started civil action against the police. The solicitor, Elkin Abrahamson, played a huge role, as did people in Liverpool 8 Law Centre. And in a sense, we reversed the fear. So we were able to prosecute police officers in Admiral Street and other police stations and bring civil actions and win. And it is that, in a sense, that throughout the 80s and 90s led, in a sense, to our fight against injustice and the strategy to combat hate crime, which by the late 80s and early 90s had meant that there was a Criminal Justice Act 1991, and we passed Section 95, which meant that there must be published figures showing the extent of discrimination. The murder of Stephen Lawrence was not the first, and sadly has not been the last, but that from 1993 onwards, and the fight of Doreen and Neville Lawrence must be recognized as an iconic moment that I experienced. I missed the 1981 uprisings because I was on a year's gap working in France, and therefore saw only the TV images of what was happening in Brixton, in Toxteth, in Liverpool 8, and all over the United Kingdom, in fact. But my realization when I came back and passed the bar exams in 1982, that this Lord Scarman report in 1981 had not really led to concrete and deeply felt economic changes, but the rudiments of reality of racism that we grapple with today were still there. But it was one of those seminal moments that did shift circumstances, and certainly a lot of Caribbean and Asian people that otherwise would not have gone to local government managed to do it. And I can't leave out, of course, the marvelous victory of those first four Black MPs, and Albert, Keith Vaz, Paul Boateng, in the first, in a sense, cohort of people to get into Parliament. In the aftermath of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, of course, there were several years that went by before we had the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. And again, that had to be fought for, and great tribute is paid to those lawyers who represented, often for free, both the family and others. And we had a significant amount of unity, which again was not easy at times, but between the African, Caribbean and Asian communities, and which of course sometimes came at a price, but was absolutely fundamental if you're in a minority community and people of color in the United Kingdom. So I had, fast forwarding again, some of my inspiration from the National Bar Association, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, and in 1988 went with Rudy Narayan and 20 others to Washington, DC and Howard University. Listened to some marvelous singers in the Blues Alley, Jazz Cafe, listened to civil rights activists. Didn't know who Sarah Vaughan was, to my ignorance. I sung at my table. So I had a lot of learning to do, but actually connected with my African American brothers, my brothers and sisters in Georgia, who I did not know by name and probably will never know, but played an enormous part at that conference and others. And returned to the rights cases in Liverpool 8 with a fire in my heart and the confidence that, in a sense, I had the world on my side. And I paid tribute to people such as Nigel Fraser, the barrister who, for out of Handsworth, fought with great courage and fought the rather racist judge, the reformer of Liverpool, the late recorder of Liverpool, who was called Stripes because he sent black people to prison at the time, I recall. But we won. And those cases left a significant mark, not only on the local community, but on me. And around that time, we had our first meeting in 1988 or 1989 with the former Lord Chancellor, Lord Mackay of Clashfern. It took us hard to get in the meeting because it was very difficult for security guards to believe there were any black lawyers, let alone 6 of us, meeting the Lord Chancellor. And we got directed to the Lord Chancellor's building several times before we managed to get through. And we began a series of meetings with government where the Home Office and the Lord Chancellor's Department encouraged us to become judges. And I actually had not seen any judge, African, Caribbean, or Asian, in the late 80s at all. We had a few magistrates, but that was really it. And so I really dismissed the idea as something which was not going to be a reality. And it was a black woman who son I represented he'd been convicted of a burglary. I'd done my plea in mitigation, seen him in the cells, and she came up to me afterwards in court and said, "When are you going to get up there and be one of those?" And she pointed at the bench. And I actually didn't really understand. So I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Well, when are you going to be a judge?" And I actually hadn't crossed my mind. I shamefacedly had to say, the thought had never crossed my mind. Judges were all white, Oxbridge, middle class, and they certainly didn't look like or sound like me. And that was a realization that really it was no good always shouting from the sidelines. One has to get involved and try and take some of the power yourself and take responsibility. So over the next 10 years, it took me 10 years of applications and refusals. And I eventually got through, not because the system wanted to recognize I was capable, but because some of my white contemporaries were getting appointed, I wasn't. And I wrote to a number of High Court judges and said, "Listen, I'm going to have to take this to the papers because this is a disgrace." They called me in for interviews. I had been sitting, I should say, as a part-time immigration judge or adjudicator, but you didn't need to be legally qualified to do that. I think they let me in by accident. And so I was appointed in 2003 to be a recorder in the Crown Court and sit with a jury, and to be a part-time employment tribunal chair. And so not for the first time, I had some power, both as an immigration judge, employment judge, and a recorder, to decide on whether some of my people went to prison or not. In fact, decided whether anybody may or may not go to, leave aside in imposing, applying as I must. Racism wasn't a done deal, and I knew that having become a member of the Metropolitan Police Authority in 2000, helping with various commissions on deaths in custody, the fight and campaign against stop and search, and the plight of refugees, I saw, in a sense, firsthand in the court what would happen to our people. And so the moment at which, and you get many moments in your career where you have to stand up and do what's right. And one of my first as an immigration was a young, an elderly, very elderly Nepalese man who'd applied to come and stay with us to visit solely his nephew in, I think, Birmingham. And it was refused, as it usually was, by an entry clearance officer on the basis that he hadn't sufficient funds, would not return home. The usual catalogue of answers that he gave for refusing people from the Indian subcontinent to visit their relatives. And in the background of the old man's application, I read that this Nepalese person had been a Gurkha. He'd fought with the British at Tobruk. He'd been part of the fight against the Nazis in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, and again, after being wounded in Palermo and Anzio, he had even survived to fight in France. And yet, the British had the audacity to refuse this former Gurkha soldier even the right to visit his nephew. I allowed it. And I think it may have been overturned on appeal, but I think thereafter I found that I would not, as a judge, have that power and exercise it to the detriment of my people, even if at times I had an uphill struggle trying to justify it in terms of the law or the case law that I had to apply. The same happened in terms of women and people coming with HIV/AIDS, and I refused point blank to deport anybody, even when the law said from the House of Lords downwards that, in a sense, their right was of survival was really neither here nor there, and the British used, as they often do, the floodgates argument to justify their removal. I would not countenance that, and even if it meant buying people another year or 2 years of living in dignity without being fully returned to a continent where the expensive drugs were often not available, then I would not take part in their removal. But that is a matter of certainly my conscience, and everybody who sits in judicial office has to face that at times. So I sat for around about 3,000 days as a Crown Court judge, immigration judge, employment judge, and I won't bore you with the stories, but it was interesting work, often very challenging. I was able to, as a representative or chair of the Hate Crime Forum, to ensure that there was a system whereby the Crown Prosecution Service and the judiciary had to think before removing the racially aggravated element of a sentence or a charge, because obviously victims wanted hate crime prosecuted. It's no good at just being on the statute books. It's had to be fulfilled and had to be prosecuted, even if that led to a failed prosecution, rather to try and fail than not to try at all. The way in which you practice as a part-time judge is that you do enjoy some freedom to engage in public discourse, in politics. And I proudly say I was able to go on demonstrations against racist laws, against, in a sense, stop and search, and in many, many other instances was able to take part in the civil rights struggle, which was given a boost by Johnny Cochran, O.J. Simpson's lawyer, coming to the United Kingdom in 1995, by Eric Holder, the former US Attorney General, coming in 1998 and speaking and giving his support to hate crime legislation. But as a judge, you still had to be very careful. And although I spoke out many times, I normally did remember to say that I spoke only in a personal capacity, not in a judicial capacity, and that anything I said, if it could be taken down and used against me, it would only be in my own name and not as a judge. But there's always a time when you forget that. And my seminal moment came when I answered a community call back in April 2000 community setting to help raise the issue about the removal of Rahman, who was the first Muslim mayor of London, of a borough in London, the borough of Newham. And he'd been challenged in the courts, he'd been challenged before the Crown Prosecution Service, and there'd been no case to answer. And so I believe, if my recollection is correct, several members of the British National Party and others complained to the Electoral Commission. They instigated proceedings, and it came before an Electoral College judge, who I and others, others really criticised in terms of judgment, which ran to 180 pages. The questionable part was that he alluded to the fact that Lutfur Rahman, I think, had played what is euphemistically called by white people the race card. Race card, I find an offensive term generally, because slavery was never a card, colonialism was never a card, oppression, rape, torture, and brutalization of a people is never a card to be dealt or played as an advantage. But somehow it is something that we have in our back pocket to play when we need to defend, in a sense, something that is intrinsically wrong. Leaving aside the rights or wrongs, or whether or not that judgment may have been flawed, I gave a short speech, it wasn't scripted. Somebody had been mentioning earlier on that judges in the United Kingdom or England and Wales, were all white, male, and middle class. And I stand up and said, rather jokingly, well, I'm not. You know, there are some exceptions, but I'm part-time. And there was a bit of a laugh from the dominantly Asian, Bengali audience, but there was a number of African, Caribbean, white people there, people of color generally, unionists, and a very mixed audience, something maybe about 800 to 1,000. And I gave some of my experiences on the institutional nature of racism. I may have referred to colleagues because I just had some of my immigration judge colleagues complain about the racism and exclusion that they'd faced from some of their white colleagues, where I was sitting at the time. I was upset and incensed by all my experiences. I got off the stage very quickly. I did forget to say, and it probably was for the time to say that I spoke in personal capacity, and I think I said this judgment as opposed to these judgments are called into question. And of course, one of the things I had some vague recollection is you're not publicly meant to criticize a fellow judge. Anyway, I had the bright idea of putting that on YouTube, and within about a couple of months, some unbeknown and probably quite racist person complained to the Judicial Conduct Investigation Office. And I think there was also somebody within the media got a friend of his who was a High Court judge who would remain nameless, who also raised a complaint. The first I heard of it was I got a letter from the JCIO sometime in July 2015 calling into question my conduct. And really, to be quite honest, it was a bit of a storm in a teacup. It may have been a slip of the tongue. It's certainly, I did take a tilt on the racism in the judicial system. And I'd been part of the necessity of training judges, which had been authorized and taken place between 1991 and 1995, where we trained some 1,800 full-time and part-time judges in the United Kingdom under Lord Taylor of Gosforth, the former Lord Chief Justice, who actually, in the day, my mum had asked for me if I could have a few words with him to get some advice. He had refused. At that time, many years later, I reminded him, and he somehow seemed to have some amnesia about this black kid from Northumberland whose mum had asked for some advice for her son. But it's a small world. He, who's passed on many years ago, did his bit, it would have to be said late in the day, to persuade that training was necessary. And we had campaigns by the National Association of Probation Officers, the Association of Black Probation Officers, Black Police Officers, National Black Caucuses, and many others to force, in a sense, the judiciary to take that training on board. And that was the background. And there are equality codes and the bar, in the law society, in the judiciary, which had to be fought for. The question is, are they observed more than the observance? And so I learned from that July onwards that I had a case to answer of a electoral college judge by my words, and that really I should face some disciplinary action. And without going into the nitty-gritty of it, I actually just was going to respond in a fairly low-key way, not accept that I'd done anything intrinsically wrong, and probably take a slap on the wrist. What then happened was that, continuing to sit, which I did as a reporter, immigration judge, between the July and the November, I was going for a training course in Victoria. And about 6 o'clock that morning, I received an email from a presiding judge of the South East Circuit, who said, it's come to their attention that I conduct, and that it would be best for me if I decided to recuse myself from sitting forthwith, and if I didn't do so, they would have to take the matter further. That led to a rather upsetting and traumatic morning. I had the benefit of Joel Benathan, QC, who's a fellow barrister at Tooks Court, who sat in with me at the rather distressing interview I had with that presiding judge. And I was left in no doubt that effectively I was told to suspend myself or else. I hurriedly over the weekend drafted some sort of compromise where I wouldn't say anything further in public. That I also looked up the fact, and I reminded them during that meeting, that there were 3 white immigration judges who had been accused of race discrimination and harassment of a black woman, individuals at the time. They were never dealt with at all for what they are alleged to have done. And by a direct comparison, here was me accused of something trivial and minor and being told to suspend myself or else. That weekend, which I suppose the protagonist didn't know, my very best friend at the bar and very close personal friend was Tana Milvaganam, a great barrister of Sri Lankan Tamil origin, who fought for the rights of people, all people, up and down the country, is famous for some many great cases that she did in the Old Bailey, in Manchester, in all over the country, passed away. And that weekend, I came to know of her passing. And so, in a sense, my fight back against the racism or the perceived racism I've never been accepted by those in power and authority, but they don't have to. And I decided to fight. So fast forwarding, there was a disciplinary hearing where the panel was convened because a nominated judge said that there was a case to answer. The disciplinary panel was comprised of people I don't need to name, but there were some, we believed, significant errors in that. And one particular phrase I remember left out, saying that my conduct was exacerbated by the fact that I was a senior or well-known ethnic minority barrister. And that phrase, in a sense, is often what gives the clue to the mindset of white people in power and authority. The fact that my conduct could not only be contrary to any disciplinary provision, but it had to be exacerbated by the fact that I'm a person of color. And so that was one of the, in fact, the basis upon which I challenged the decision of the disciplinary panel. There were others, but that was the main key. And often, in terms of words and conduct, white people are never going to say, I don't like you because you're black. Things have moved on, and racism, as you well know, is very subtle and is very hard to pinpoint, even in the most careful of judgments, written by the most intelligent and well-educated people, but it can be there. So I also complained about what I regard as, and they did to their credit, regard my suspension as being unlawful, attempted suspension. I was not suspended, but only because I'd threatened, in a sense, and I had mind to turn up at Harrow Crown Court on that Monday after that weekend training course. So I wasn't suspended. The agreement was that I would continue to sit as a judge, which I did until I retired last June. And therefore, to some extent, I had that victory in that they didn't interfere with my judicial study sitting, which is my main income at the time. And I did remonstrate when the decision went to the Lord Chancellor and the Cabinet Minister, the Lord Chancellor, who'd studiously ignored the fact that I had been what I regarded as, and even the disciplinary panel agreed that had been an unlawful attempt to suspend me from sitting. It had been done in a wholly inappropriate manner. No judge could suspend another judge without a report being made to the Lord Chancellor. No such report was filed. No such report was requested. And the threat was undoubtedly just that: either you suspend yourself, or we will do it for you, without the necessary format or procedure being followed at all. So the disciplinary warning that I eventually got from the former Lord Chief Justice and Lord Chancellor ignored any apology. Unbeknown to me, the Judicial Conduct Information Office poo-pooed the idea of any form of apology, even though that had been recommended by the disciplinary panel, as I said, to their credit. And there was, behind the scenes, an attempt over the next 18 months to give some form of apology. I didn't know. And so I took out I'd taken out one ET1 against about my suspension. I took out a second one against the disciplinary panel, and including the Lord Chancellor and former Lord Chief Justice in that, because of their failure, in a sense, as I said, to offer any form of apology, but also failure to investigate where had been suspended, or there had been an attempted suspension of my judicial ticket in all 3 jurisdictions. And there'd been a concession in one of the emails that, well, we should handle this better next time. Well, I think that was something I got disclosed eventually. Publicly, the Guardian newspaper carried the Lord Chancellor, Chief Justice, complaining about this treatment. And so it was the consequence of that the same little white racist complainant that complained originally came alive again, sent me a tweet and said something about, obviously, you're not showing the necessary contrition for the disciplinary sanction. And I said, well, racism is alive and well, it would seem. And so there was a second complaint. This went to another nominated judge, again, a very senior member of the judiciary. And in a decision that came, I think, in 2017, after some delay, that person said that I wasn't fit to be a judge. In fact, I should be suspended and removed from judicial office forthwith. And one of them, when the Lord Chancellor, Lord Chief Justice, and these, by now, I think 7 or 8 respondents replied in the Employment Tribunal, they said that they enjoyed judicial immunity, which was a fact that I couldn't sue them in the Employment Tribunal because they were embarked in a quasi-judicial function. And it took a decision of the Supreme Court in 2017 in a case of P versus the MPS, where a black policewoman had argued about the lack of immunity of a police disciplinary tribunal successfully. The Society of Black Lawyers, National Black Caucus, Black Sox, and many, many others, Black Vote intervened, and they were recognized in court. I should have said something, but we put our written submission, and the court, led very ably by Lady Justice Hale, ruled in the favor of P and in me, and the case trundled on. And there was application by the government that there was no case to answer. That was overturned with a marvelous group of supporters, and anybody who came to support my case in Leeds Employment Tribunal before the Employment Appeal Tribunal in London, I know an enormous debt of gratitude to everybody out there, too numerous to mention, but each and every one of you, a marvelous debt of gratitude for the strength and courage that you gave me, not least my family and my sons, who were both marvelous, and my wife. So thank you to all of you. And in a sense, it was their strength and courage that my preoccupation with this, which helped. So the case was set down for the 5th of July this year, eventually. There was a case to answer on the vast majority of my charges that I'd brought, and the allegations were to be heard in Leeds Employment Tribunal. And there was a settlement offer, and without going into any of the details, which I'm not allowed to, there was a fairly significant financial settlement, which allowed me to draw a line under it. The Judicial Conduct Information Office wrote a very belated apology for my unlawful suspension. The warning remained on my judicial record, but really I'd retired, so what the hell? But I'd held them to account. And I think all the respondents knew that if necessary, I would have gone the distance and would have had my day in court. But I think, as people will know, taken on proceedings, after 6 years, I felt I had won. I'd made my point, got my apology, had it in the law for suspension obtained for all judges in Wales, and therefore I'd partly led also to a new organisation, the Judicial Support Network, set up by Judge Callie Cole and others, who themselves face their own battles against the establishment and have a enormous amount of courage in still doing so, because they still continue to, and so they will know who they are. But I'm proud to be supporting that network and give them all due respect for the fact that they continue to perform their judicial functions and yet fight for the rights of themselves and others. So I've seen some questions come up, and obviously I'm happy to answer those. But for those who, if you wish to know, that in spite of all of that, I have been proud to continue as part of the struggle. I was there in 2015, 16 and 17 on a refugee missions to Lampedusa, to Sicily, to Rome, working with the Italian government and Coast Guard to help tell the story of refugees crossing the Mediterranean. We've worked with the Association of Muslim Lawyers in Lebanon, due to go back there next year, with many others. And so together with that fight, I am proud to be part of a group of commissioners who helped write the report, murder of George Floyd and 44 other African Americans. That report was submitted to the United Nations in June of this year. And again, I thank those in the National Conference of Black Lawyers, Professor Lennox Hines, and all the people who have made that commission, and all the families, first and foremost, who had the courage and conviction to tell their stories. In Kenya, I'm hopefully supporting the fight against land injustice, and that is a fight that Kenyans and Africans all over the continent know, that whether the British, in their fight to retain their power and influence under colonial rule, they did so at the great expense of the torture, mutilation, murder and oppression of many Africans. And I'm happy to answer questions on that, but there is a Mau Mau struggle that continues here. There's a struggle against Unilever and many other companies in Kericho and Bomet counties who hold huge tracts of land. Many British and American nationals who hold well over 100,000 acres of land in Laikipia County, and multinationals who make huge profits in Kenya and other parts of East and Central Africa and exploit all people. And so I'm happy to answer some questions on my own personal struggle, but hopefully on the struggle of others in the time that I have. And I know that I've gone over my allotted space of an hour. So that's part of my story, not the whole story, but it's basically a humble story of my people, and I'm proud to be part. Thank you.
All right, Judge Herbert, have you written a book, or are you planning to write a book? That's one question from the chat.
The answer is yes. I haven't got around to it as yet. I wrote 110,000 words of a novel, basically based around myself and a fictional lawyer at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, but I didn't have quite the skills, the fictional skills that I needed, so it's still an unfinished fiction, but I think it's about time. And yes, I am due to write my own story. It may not be quite as inspirational as Superintendent Leroy Logan's, but I'll do my best.
All right, got a question here from Len, who said, given all what's happened in your career, would you do it all again? And who would you recommend the legal profession, would you recommend the legal profession as a career?
Yes, I'd do it all again. I've some amazing people. I've met a young girl in South London who walked with us through Bermondsey when we were feeling very down and dejected, and were uplifted by a 12-year-old girl who said, the fight against racism is necessary, please continue. I've been humbled to meet Desmond Tutu, Trey Martin's brother, and many families and victims of racism over the years. who have given me the courage to continue. When here in Kenya, to a lady who tea outside of Nairobi for $80, 8,000 shillings a month, and whose simple request is that she have a better future for her children. So all of those people absolutely do it all again. And to people recommended to come into the law, of course, you can come and achieve this. And a young law student who may be listening that is of Nigerian origin from Ireland, her story is not unique. Don't lose heart. Don't be put off by any letters of rejection you give, or you get rather from the system, because and you undoubtedly will get through.
Okay. The question is, how active is a society for Black lawyers, and how can you get involved with the SBL if you wish to do so?
The society isn't that active at present, unfortunately. You know, it's been for a number of different reasons. Some younger lawyers take over. Certainly I'm in Kenya, so it's a bit difficult to continue it with the same enthusiasm or just ability I had before. But we have people such as David Nita and many, many others who are still in the UK and practicing. And I think it is, in a sense, a story that needs continuing. So we have a website based in Kenya. We do have a good, in a sense, track record of activism. And there are other lawyers groups that do an enormous Black Solicitors Network, Society of Asian Lawyers, and others who do great work in their own particular way. We are probably, or had historically, were the most outspoken politically, but that is something that we pick. And so you can get involved by supporting other organizations and getting active within AL, and by all means get in touch through the website or through the email address, which I think can be put up on the screen. And I hope to have a meeting sometime between the 5th and 14th of November in London to try and get some new recruits who can.
Do you know of any kind of lawyers that
over.
campaign for human rights in Jamaica?
Yes, there are. I mean, one of the most famous in recent times is the English lawyer Lord Gifford, but there are many, many others who I know. The late Sandra Graham of Society of Black Lawyers worked in Montego Bay, and I think if you just Google human rights lawyers in Jamaica, you'll come up with a plethora of them. John Rowbottom is now based in Florida, and a great barrister in the United Kingdom of Jamaican origin, and many, many others there. But yes, they are there, and these days of Google and internet, you don't have to look too far to find them.
Yeah, Grace says, what in your opinion, what has been the most important piece of legislation in the UK which has helped the struggle against racism?
That's a difficult question. You know, they are part of a tapestry, but no law is effective unless you have people to enforce it. And so the Equality Act 2010 is, as far as it goes, is okay, but the enforcement lacks teeth. And that is because it is still economically viable for the public sector to be racist in the United Kingdom. The damages that are payable generally in race discrimination and other cases are so risible as to make it almost economically viable to discriminate. And therefore, you know, it does have the force that the legislation has in the US, and even as you know, in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement had to fight an uphill struggle, still has to fight for equality and justice. An important piece of legislation. The hate crime is only as strong as the people that enforce it, and therefore we found time after time that unless you have a prosecution, lawyers, civil rights activists, and most of all the community who are willing to get out there on the streets, then the legislation will only be part of the puzzle. You have to have enforcement.
Okay. Leila says, is there more scope for wider community activism to support Society Black lawyers in the ongoing journey for equality and justice?
Anybody who watched the Black Lives Matter movement explode on the streets across the world must be left with the impression that struggles grow from the grassroots upwards. Rarely, but rarely, do they start with a leader going and giving the ideology from the top down. They help, but in a sense, you needed a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, to give rise to the messages that went to Dr. Martin Luther King. And you needed, in a sense, that trial baptism fire of the till before, in a sense, you had the real dynamics take place where the civil rights movement transcended race and class to bring it to most Americans. And I think the struggle for grassroots movements is to keep that fire and to direct that energy into the fact that it moves the bar for all, and it doesn't fizzle out. And so it is as relevant for Kenya as they did in Nigeria with the SARS protest. And many people have said to me that, well, really, you have to have the struggle at home first. I am an international panelist, and I believe very much that the struggle in London or Paris or Berlin or Mississippi is the same struggle, slightly different features, dynamics, but it's exactly the same struggle as you face in Abuja or Lagos or in Nairobi. The struggle against people with power and authority can have a racial dynamic, but it doesn't necessarily have to. It can simply be the struggle between those in power and authority who have access to justice. I've just lost the signal again.
Yeah, I can hear you now. You're back on now.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
You had a question about what advice would you give to litigants in person?
I mean, normally it's to get some legal representation. If you can't get that from one of the pro bono agencies out there, the Bar Council has a good pro bono service, but it has to be, I think, a referral through a law centre or other body. Is read as much as you can. Go and sit into in cases, hear what the litigants, barristers, advocates, solicitor advocates are saying, take notes, and in a sense, practice, and don't go in unprepared. There is no actual magic about being a lawyer. I cannot be a surgeon, but most surgeons can be, and other people can be, represent themselves and can be litigants in person or lawyers. It's not easy. And certainly somebody from a working class background of sorts, I had felt rather self-conscious about my accent and believed that, you know, intelligence and intellect went with some Oxbridge accent. It doesn't. Mm-hmm. And we can, as you know, in African, Caribbean and Asian culture, have some of the best advocates that has ever produced. We just sometimes don't have the self-confidence to see it.
Alex says, my company is in the early stages of designing a robo-law, artificial intelligence, so that our people have their rights to hand, particularly in the case of human rights, police, and school expulsions. Do you think this will be helpful to the public and to lawyers?
Yes, I think any mechanism you have to empower people on the streets or in terms of school is helpful. You'll note an exclude compared to their white counterpart gives them the tools in which to fight the system is invaluable. And you know, one of the things that the Black Panther movement did all over America was to have tutorials. It basically gave empowerment to people to their rights. And that's exactly what the Mau fighters did. People such as Dedan Kimathi, Pia Gama Pinto here, they're actually just a so-called, as the British would like to dub it, a movement of terrorists, actually of freedom fighters who had an amazing network of hospitals, courts, schools, and in a sense, a liberation struggle, which was an intellectual struggle, and it took up the armed struggle. And that essentially is that teaching and giving back the learning that we have gathered over the years.
What advice would you give to the judiciary when it comes to supporting Black judges to fight or survive discrimination?
Well, I think some of them do. I mean, I hesitate to, in a sense, lump all white members of the senior or judiciary a waste of time. I have to say that some of my strongest support came from my white colleagues. It is difficult. It is not to be taken for granted. And the system itself can harass people, as I've learned, whatever their racial origin, whatever their ethnicity or gender or sexuality, it does happen, or disability. But people have to get in networks, they have to speak out. The senior judiciary, in a sense, have to learn. And back in the early 90s, we were told by those in power that whilst recorders, circuit judges needed training on race, the senior judiciary needed none. They were the people who were most in need of it, because they, in a sense, when they were members of the bar, as they are, I think at the time, 94% of all the senior judges were former barristers and not solicitors. They were the people who, generally speaking, would not allow African, Caribbean or Asian people into chambers. Whether they did it deliberately or it was part of a systemic institutional racism matters not. The outcome was the same. But I think the necessity of having people of African and Asian descent sit on a regular basis, not necessarily in court, of course, but buddy up with people on a regular basis, change every year, and get into their minds and their culture is something which goes far and beyond any so-called race training, which I think is, generally speaking, had its day and doesn't provide anything other than a very short vignette for the people you're addressing. And it can become a tick box exercise.
Can you tell us a bit about your conference in December? You were saying about you can get a ticket to Kenya for $500 or whatever it is, and to fly out there and come to this conference?
Yes, no, we'd love you to do that. It's slightly more expensive than that. It's probably maybe about 900, but the conference is the Bandung conference taken after the 1955 first non-aligned conference in Bandung, the town in Indonesia, where there were no Europeans at that conference, I have to say. It was a conference exclusively for African, Caribbean, and Asian people coming out of colonialism to attend. Malcolm X made good friends with Pia Gama Pinto of the Mau Mau movement, the Kenyan. And the Bandung Conference is designed to look at issues of human rights here in Kenya and East Africa. We have an array of subjects looking at land injustice, the recent ruling by the Human Rights Special Rapporteur against the British government, calling for reparations to be paid to 100,000 Kipsigis and Talai people who had their land removed. They were forcibly deported from their land in some of the best farmland in Kenya. We're looking at that with Governor Chepkwony of Kericho County. We hope to have the former Chief Justice of Kenya, Dr. Willie Mutunga, speak, and the many, many other leaders of the human rights movement in Kenya and from the United Kingdom. I'll be joined by some of my judicial colleagues in the United Kingdom. The fare is British Airways, I have to say, fare at the moment, which is held at £743. We need at least 10 people to travel out on the 9th of December, coming back on the 19th or thereabouts. That is held at the moment at that price only until the 14th of October. So if people are interested, that is one way. We've booked some of a very good range of 3 hotels in Nairobi that people can stay. The conference is going to be held at the Catholic University of Eastern Africa, down the road from me in Karen, in Nairobi. We are going to have a series of meetings for the diaspora and Kenyans, which may involve visits to Committee Maximum Security Prison. We would like to raise the issue of the 1,090 Kenyans who still lie in unmarked graves in that prison, including the Mao leader, the venerated Dedan Kimathi. We also hope to go and visit an orphanage in Kibra, one of the largest slums in Nairobi, but also to have some of that downtime where we can network with human rights defenders here in Kenya, whether it's the Kenya Human Rights Commission, Bandung Conference, the defense campaigns that are running here, such as Haki from the coast in Mombasa. And I'll be joined by my co-chair, Dr. Myrna Kalsi, in her own personal capacity, who's a leading forensic examiner here in Kenya, but also many, many other lawyers who are part of Kenya, who will be discussing how the diaspora can link through the Kenya Diaspora Alliance, the other Kenyan-based organizations, which are seeking to engage with the diaspora, both in North America, South America, in Europe, and basically bringing people home. So I look to work, we're going to be working with the Pan-African Lawyers Union, the CEO, Donald Dyer, give a big shout out to them. And I apologize if I've missed many of the organizations that we're working with, but Kapawa, which is the Kenyan agriculture and plantation workers, who are doing some marvelous work fighting for the rights of workers. So if you want to come, have a view to what the Pan-African world is looking like in Kenya, we can ensure that you'll have a marvelous week. And we put on an amazing program between the 9th of December and the 19th. And if you've got the energy and resources available, you can always go to the coast at Mombasa or take part in the Diaspora Alliance of Tanzania, where our Jamaican convener, Grace Amina James, has a marvelous organization down there in Dar es Salaam. So, yeah, come and be part of it. You can get details online from
what's the
website, which is www.bandungconference.com. It isn't there at the moment, but the details will be there in around about 7 days' time. And if you want to get through to further details about the conference, we've got a WhatsApp group which is going. You can email me on pherb5law@aol.com and I can add you to that group. That's pherb5law@aol.com, and we'll happily supply you with information. And I should say that my very good friend is the lawyer for George Floyd, Benjamin Crump, and it is intended that the George Floyd Foundation and family will be visiting London and East Africa, West Africa and South Africa sometime between September and December next year. And that we are working closely with Black Sox, marvelous organization in the United Kingdom, who already has, working with other groups, has an office in Uganda, and we're really looking to make this a Pan-African, East African venture. And Bandung Conference is just one of many organizations, both here and across the continent, that seek to have a unified approach. And a great shout out to Member of Parliament, Bel Rubiero Addy, who's doing a fantastic work with her colleagues, African, Caribbean and Asian members of Parliament there, and with the Congressional Black Caucus as well in the United States.
Sean had asked, how were you affected physically and mentally with the tribunal you went through? And I suppose, what did you do to kind of deal with those that stress?
Well, my family played a huge part in that, and I have to thank them deeply for their patience and perseverance and support. And it did lead actually to retiring on grounds of ill health, but in a sense, timing is everything. And my faith also helped get me through. And these things happen for a purpose. In a funny way, if you're going to leave the United Kingdom, leaving during COVID and coming to Kenya, I can think of very, very many worse places to be. And I am deeply sorry for all those who have suffered and been bereaved during this process. But I know that is particularly difficult for many of our people all over the world. And so I am just lucky to be here and to be at liberty, and successfully have left part of the struggle in the United Kingdom, but been able to pick up the struggle against the good old British government in East Africa, and do so with the support of a huge number of people here, both in Kenya and outside. And I must say, many people within the British establishment who, despite the fact that they may not speak out, actually their heart is sometimes in the right place, and they just wait, in a sense, for the right moment to do the right thing.
We got a question from Tracy. It says, after Lord Denning made his comment about Black people not sitting on jury service as they were dishonest, etc., were any of his cases reviewed, and was he reprimanded?
To my best of my knowledge, Lord Denning was never reprimanded. He actually attended Leicester University and wished me well in my exams, which I subsequently failed. I think I failed 2 of them. That was probably his fault. And I had to resit 2 my first year. I think behind the scenes, that was the reason why he was asked to retire. Nobody at that time was really disciplined. You'll recall possibly that the Recorder of Liverpool, Lord Miskin, referred to something about, I think, excuse the language, but nig-nog sitting in cases, and his excuse was it was a private after-dinner speech, and it was a joke. I mean, you know, those are that's the type of terminology which bedeviled the senior and even junior judiciary at the time. Luckily, the N in the woodpile type of comments are not heard very much these days, although I still think that is, in a sense, the tip of the iceberg. The difficulty we face is the overt racism and exclusion of our African, Caribbean, and Asian counterparts, the failure to give pupillage, training contracts, and also the selection of those of us who, in a sense, pull up the ladder afterwards. And I think one of the greatest difficulties we all face as a people is those amongst us who are not necessarily willing to sell out, but pretend there is not a problem. And you will find those of us in the law, as in medicine or any other profession, who pretend racism is yesterday's story. Never the fact that they have benefited for the struggle of others, but they actually use it as, in a sense, their enabling tool to provide for their promotion. And you will know that white people in power and authority very much like to hear any African, Caribbean, or Asian person who say there's no problem, and you can guarantee that they will be promoted the first.
The CRE no longer exists, but are there any similar groups that you could refer people to? Because, well, yeah, that's the question. CRE no longer exists, but is there anything else that people can access to get this, help fight racism?
Well, I think there's a group that's coming to the fore, and it is going to be announced sometime, I think, in October, November, or certainly by the end of this year, which will, in a sense, be far more effective. I'm not a fan of the Equality Commission. I think the removal of the old Commission of Racial Equality, whilst it did bring together the various strands of discrimination and racism and discrimination, sexism, etc., actually has led to a very weak response by what's supposed to be a non-governmental agency. It's underfunded, under-resourced, understaffed, and under-led generally. And I think the Lord Herman Ouseley was the last effective head of the CRE, who did a sterling job. But I think since leaving the Equality Commission, and it's certainly as it became known, is a shadow of its former self. So community groups, self-help, empowerment, and a soon to be launched, I believe, equivalent, possibly NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, but not called that, may actually carry the torch in the future. But the removal of CRE officers, Council for Racial Equalities, really undermined the struggle for racial justice in the United Kingdom, and their replacement is not been found since.
Can you tell us a bit about your fitness regime? You have a fan who reckons that he's a cyclist like yourself.
Well, no, I owe my cycling to a bit to COVID thing, and I think everybody was looking. So there's an amazing group of cyclists here, Derek and Joe and others, Cara, a shout out for you, and all those in Kenya who enjoy cycling, and have taken me to some amazing treks, 50 kilometers and more sometimes. And yeah, that the cycling has helped. So certainly I've become a late advent to cyclists. I can't do very much at the moment because I twisted my knee playing for another shout out, the Heavenly Cricket Club. And a brother, Mohammed Patel, was organising some amazing cricket matches for charity. Chris Lewis, Gordon Greenwich, many, many others. And one of the things we hope to do in Kenya is have a cricket match. Errol King and Tegan Kenyon, who is here, who is a leading figure in Kenyan cricket. I think there's going to be a cricket match put on, if I'm not mistaken, between this team and Kenyan 11, hopefully with me taking some part in December this year. And certainly that's one of the things we hope to do, is do NGO human rights through sport. And in a sense, a big shout out to all those people that have used that as a mechanism for positive change.
All right, Peter, I think we're coming to the end of our little session here. So for those of you who want to say any words of appreciation, you have about 5 minutes to do so before we switch off this stream. Don't forget, it will be posted on our YouTube channel in about a couple of days or so. Actually, Peter, what are you working on now? So are you just are you on holiday at the moment, or are you
well, no, I mean, contrary to the illusion, no. I'm a full-time, in a sense, host working for Bandung for the conference in December. I'm working on this Mau Mau campaign, soon to be launched, with many, many other Kenyans here and in the United Kingdom. Working on the historical injustice cases, hoping to welcome the special rapporteur to Kenya sometime before the end of the year. And then there are many, many other things in East Africa and beyond. And as I say, hopefully supporting the great work, for instance, Stafford Scott has been doing, and the marvelous exhibition that he's recently put on the uprising in Tottenham and the fight against racism and extrajudicial killings in the United Kingdom. So acting in a supportive role, and hopefully next year, amongst other things, looking to go back to do refugee work in Lebanon and other places, the Association of Muslim Lawyers, Heavenly Cricket Club, and many, many others. So there actually, I really apologize for not giving a shout out to more people. And my best friend, Michael Hart, I should say, if he's listening. Thank you very much to everybody.
All right, cool. Well, thank you, Judge Peter Herbert, for your time. It's fantastic. And if you want to find out more events like this or find more events like this, just go to our website, which is just blackhistorywalks.co.uk. We have about 12 more similar talks online, also a whole bunch of physical events as well. That's it for now. This stream will switch off in about 3 minutes.
Thank you. Fantastic. Tony, keep the good work, and thank you very much. Humbling
Welcome.
to take part.
We'll be in touch again.
God bless.
See ya.